Take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. I greatly appreciate it. And just want to say welcome to everyone. I'm really happy and honored to be able to be here and engage with you all. I just want to note that for myself, I want this to be more like a discussion than a lecture. So definitely as I'm going along, inviting where I know there's some pre-submitted questions, we'll have some Q&A later. So if anything's just really tugging on wanting to be spoken to, and I know folks are going to be monitoring the chat and you want to throw something in there, please feel free to do so. So for myself, as I really feel there's a lot of things that can be considered meditative. Maybe for some of you who are coming in, we're hearing me discussing with Anthony about martial arts, specifically Muay Thai. For myself, martial arts is an extension of my own spiritual path, so it's very meditative for me. So this meditation that we're going to do is in a sense just one of many, many ways to be able to engage in a practice. Not about right or wrong, just different. And so with that, I offer us to take a moment to orient with where we are. Oftentimes, especially with this kind of current state of the world, we're in places where we're on video and we're picking places that feel comfortable to sit and be at our computers or whatever digital screen we're at, and are oftentimes very, very familiar to us. I offer you to take a step back, and wherever you are, I offer this suggestion to see things, old things, with new eyes. Where are you right now in this moment? Allowing yourself to, wherever you were before this moment and wherever you may be after this moment. The past is a memory and the future is a dream. We are here now. So just orient into the space that you're in and find something to help you connect to that space. Oftentimes, the things and the objects in our spaces tell a story of how we're moving through our day, how we're moving through our own thoughts. And as we move through our thoughts, allowing them to lead to this moment. And I like to begin with gratitude. Gratitude for the gift of life, such a precious offering, played out amongst billions of lives, billions of times a day. And so it's really easy to, in a way, lose sight of the miracle that it is and the gift that it is. The gift of the breath, and allowing the breath to lead. Allowing the belly to fill and expand as we take in breath. And then yet to realize we actually don't need to take a breath. We can simply have some air. So just allowing ourselves to have some air and the breath to lead. Connecting to our bodies, such a wonderful gift that it is, doing so much for us. Whatever we ask of it. And if it feels comfortable, for myself, I like to just brush down my arms and my legs to just connect to my body. Just to really feel it there. Feeling my feet on the ground I'm sitting, if you're laying down, whatever connection you have to the earth, whatever part of you is connected to the earth, and feeling that support and the gratitude of the gift that is the earth and the support that it gives to us and nourishes us and allows for so much. We're in a class speaking of what some would consider and call plant medicine, a gift of the earth, just as our bodies are. And there's that interconnection. And for myself, then placing my hands over my heart, inviting you to do so if you feel comfortable to do so, and feeling the gift of my heartbeat. Our heart does so much for us, asks for nothing in return. I think about the heart, and then so often the image of it is of the larger mass centered in our chest. Yet like a tree, where yet we only see above the ground the trunk and the branches, we are aware that there is a root system that we do not see, that is also part of the tree. So allowing our thoughts to move beyond just the centered mass in our chest. Because while we may call it a circulatory system, the veins and the arteries and the capillaries that supply our body with the life force that is our blood, they all lead back and are connected and rooted to the heart. So in a way, our heart is not just in our chest, yet stretches throughout our entire body. As the heart gives us the gift, and the breath gives us the gift, and the earth gives us the gift. And just quiet gratitude, appreciation for such a gift. Allowing us to be here now. And a deep breath, and an exhale, and a deep breath, and an exhale, and yet a third time, a deep breath, and an exhale. Thank you.
Thank you. That was we've had a lot of meditations, and I don't know, that might have been my favorite. That was extremely grounding, and someone like me who has ADHD, my mind wanders a little bit, but the way that you guided that really kept me present. I like that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, so with that, I hope everyone feels a little bit more present and ready to begin this. Yeah, so we're going to start the talk in a minute, and I just want to ask you, Kufikiri, if you prefer, so students might have questions during the talk. They're going to probably put that into the chat, and if you want, we could monitor that for you, and we could interrupt you with those questions if they have to do with what you're talking about, or we can wait until the end. Which would you prefer?
Yeah, I welcome questions as we go along. Again, wanting this to be more of a discussion. I want us to talk with each other more so than me talking at everyone. So yes, please feel free where there's relevant questions to just jump in and let me know, and I'll look to respond as best I can in the moment.
Awesome, great. So yeah, we'll begin, and then when we're done, we'll have a live Q&A. Awesome.
Great.
So take it away.
Great. Well, again, thank you, everyone. Welcome. Glad to have you all here. I know this is coming on the tail end of spring break and kind of mid-time, so thank you for taking the time and just being here. If you see me looking away, it's just me going through my own thoughts that I have in notes and various things here, though again, in my own self, I tend to old school style. I get a pen and paper and I actually write down notes. So A little analog in the digital world there. But just to remind us on the description with what today's discussion is focusing with, there was the recommendation for the documentary film for those that were not able to have the time to see it prior to today's discussion. A quick synopsis: a student at MIT looking to work with learning algorithms for a product they were creating that were related to face recognition technology. And this student realizing that there was, as the film calls, a coded bias in the technology where their darker skin was not recognized by the technology. Yet when they took a white mask and put it over their face, they were then able to be recognized by the face recognition program. So to that, where are those parallels within what is being referred to today as the psychedelic renaissance? Those biases that exist within the decisions that are being made of how this moment's moving forward. Those that are the quote unquote decision makers and gatekeepers. For myself, I see this more so as an emergent moment than necessarily a renaissance moment, as the various ecosystems of the larger psychedelic community, which is very much a broad and general term, those ecosystems that are being mainstreamed are not all the ecosystems of the psychedelic community. And that's for a reason. And looking at why those specific ecosystems are being mainstreamed and not others. So as we look at that and sit with these questions, how will that play forward? What does that mean about the type of access, the type of journeyer, if you will, that is being thought of as this mainstreaming continues to unfold? In a discussion I had with a friend of mine who is on the East Coast studying at Columbia, and in the discussion we were having, they talked about their sense of plant medicine having a consciousness of its own, an awareness of its own. We were having a discussion about need. Who needs this and who needs it more? Their perspective that they offered is that if plant medicine has its own consciousness, then there is a reason why there are a certain section of the population where there is that access and ability to engage in this, looking at need, than others, which gave me a moment of pause to reflect and think about something I heard before that spoke to the prison industrial system, and that the guards are locked up with the prisoners too, becoming just as institutionalized. So expanding that out to more general systems of oppression, using that a metaphor, if the guards were to be the ones to gain access to plant medicine as opposed to the prisoners, how does that have us then look at the question of need? Our engagement is in seeking and expanding our own expanded consciousness and awareness. Something to consider. Not necessarily something that, again, I'm presenting having some answer for. We all have a piece of what this moment is. Though to consider what does that really look like when we talk about need? Yet there are those who are making decisions around the protocols. There are those out there that are creating the language around best practices. So who has that information to form these decisions? And how is that being used to further the efforts of the ecosystems within the psychedelic community that are being mainstreamed? And to be clear, in that way, we are looking at clinical research, and we are looking at therapeutic. Not solely, though primarily, the parts of the psychedelic community that are being mainstreamed. And so when we're in an environment that, my word, entheogens, there's so many, there's a buffet of word choices, and that can be its own conversation. And maybe we'll get into that if anyone has a question around it. Psychedelics, entheogens, plant medicine make strange bedfellows of clinical science and behavioral science. So we have this clinical science field being mainstreamed, we have this behavioral science field being mainstreamed. What is the information that they are gathering to make their choices? How are they gathering this information? There are already conversations, especially as it relates to the clinical side, of who are the pools? Who are they looking at? Who are they engaging? When they're doing trial studies, who are they reaching out to? What communities are they giving consideration to? How much intersectionality is there present? What efforts are really being made in that way? Because that speaks to who the end user is, as far as how those decision makers see who the end user is. Again, those decisions help us to see where maybe those biases might exist around individuals, organizations, entities, institutions who are, again, pushing this mainstream effort forward. Now, there's a lot of work to be done in these areas, and that is clear. Though when asked at a talk of how to impact change, what does that look like? In a very matter-of-fact way, when we look at the clinical and the behavioral side that is being mainstreamed, it really takes risk takers. Because we can have ideals, we can have our principles, we can look to have the courage of character to want to stand up for what we believe in. Yet at the same time, when you are working with a budget, and that budget is sourced through grants, through outside funding, how much leeway, how much room for moving beyond the more narrow and immediate scope of the work is there to raise concerns around those that are not being represented? Because once the money comes into the room, you'll notice the conversation takes on a different tone. And so too, the title of our today's discussion, like, how can entheogens help us to decolonize our minds and our society? so many living their lives on their conditioning and not necessarily on their purpose. How much awareness beyond the conditioning is there to empower a change of action? One of the obvious biases that exists in larger society, and there are those that may be of the opinion that because of the work engaged with plant medicine and with entheogens, the psychedelic community is in some way able to buffer itself from the ills of society. Do I believe that to be a false belief system? I think has been evident over the past year. And for myself, the idea, as I would describe, the economic construct of race created to divide continues to do so. Recently, quick story. With my work, I've been remote, though the possibility of limited access back to the office and the facility coming back up. I went to get tested because this year the only thing I want negative about myself is my test results. Though noticing on the screening form, certain information required, certain information optional. This is a health screening. The required information, my race. The optional information, my ethnicity. Gave me a moment of pause, something to consider. I had to tell them what my race was. I did not have to tell them what my ethnicity is. And I say race was and ethnicity is because, again, I see race as a construct. One that is at the detriment of all. When we are not needing to acknowledge our ethnicity, though when communicating and engaging with others, we must acknowledge our race. Something to consider. Which is unique, again, to the psychedelic community, given that the benefit of even engaging in these practices is, to in a large degree, due to the indigenous land stewards of the world, and more specifically with the engagement here of the Americas, and having done so in the face of genocide. And still to today, having to take action against government to have proper representation and sovereignty to practice as they see fit. So we have millions of dollars being poured into research for a market that doesn't even exist yet to the scope that you would think it does, given certain conversations. Yes, ketamine is legal, and there is ways to work in a therapeutic way. So that is more seen as a synthetic form of psychedelic. So when we're looking at entheogens that are more plant-based, coming from these indigenous cultures, and they're still fighting for a voice while millions of dollars are being spent on research for pools that are not diverse, to lead us where? To create what product? To create what service? To highlight what voices? To engage with what sections of society? Again, the conditioning. I heard someone once say as a joke, "What do fish talk about?" I don't know, but I'm sure it's not the water. What is the water all around us we do not see? How do we broaden our perceptions? How can we discover our own blind spots? If most of what we know, or as some would say, think to know, is something that we either inherited from others or adopted for ourselves, what is truly our own? How do we challenge these predetermined conclusions? How can we foster deeper work, establishing lasting practices, not just reactionary actions that can lead to what is kind of the cachet in the moment, greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially as it relates to the psychedelic community in the areas that are, again, being mainstreamed. And again, being mainstreamed for a reason. Who is determining what access looks like? This emergent moment coinciding with the social unrest that we are seeing, I do not believe to be a coincidence, as I myself am not a big believer in coincidence, though I am a big believer in synchronicity. So what is the opportunity that is presented to us, offering to us? When we're still seeing where society's racial blind spots and false belief systems are continually being perpetuated, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. You could say consciously or unconsciously. Yet the impact will still be felt. So how is it where diverse communities, and whether they identify themselves as a community or as an individual, whether that be by their ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identification, able-bodied, if they are not seeing themselves represented in where this moment is going of being mainstreamed, not seeing a place for themselves within, how can there be a feeling that their voice and their unique perspective is valued, let alone desired if it is not coveted. Which is, again, presenting itself at a very synchronicitous moment, as there are more and more individuals in diverse communities, especially ethnically diverse communities, that are engaging with plant medicine in a way of peering into their own blind spots, discovering their false belief systems, defining for themselves their own identity, using these indigenous practices to, in a way, remind themselves of their own indigenous legacy. And as I had someone say it to me, there are those of uninterrupted indigenous legacy, and there are those of interrupted indigenous legacy. So we find ourselves with these various emergent forces, a mainstreaming, a commercialization, a monetization, a spiritual connecting, reconnecting of ancestral legacy, ancestral identity. One thing that is a practice that carries over throughout the various ecosystems, the healing circle. Whether that be in a space of engagement or integration. And one of the key elements of the practice is being able to hold space. When I first had my initial experiences, I was not aware of what it meant to hold space. Though, in learning to do so for myself, understanding the, for lack of a better term, the tools needed to do so, I quickly discovered that it is a very seemingly on the surface simple phrase, though a very complex concept. To hold space, to not grab, to not grip, to not ensnare or embrace, to hold. And for me, my experiences and my journey, there is a unique relationship required to be able to hold space. Now, I mentioned this in the context of the healing circle, though again, this can happen with just the self. As my introduction was in how do I hold space for myself when I am engaging? How do I find balance in a challenging moment? where I do not have all the control. For at times I have found within myself and in the experiences of others, the challenge is antagonized by resistance. Resistance to loss of control. And so when we find ourselves in a space of engaging, whether we're holding space for ourselves or someone is holding space for us, or whether we're holding space for another, how are we meeting that resistance? Are we conscious of it? Is it unconscious? Because it's a journey and not a destination. And it's not to say that a moment realized where engaging presented itself without resistance means that we've somehow left that behind us going forward. And it's not something we won't revisit again. And so that journey, like the relationship of holding space, as myself having a background in performing arts, I see it similar to a dance. The dance of holding space and responding to the moment for whatever is needed, to not feed off of it, to not feed into it, though to simply have a balance of responding. Something I mentioned earlier in how martial arts is an extension of my own spiritual path. A great martial artist named Bruce Lee, in an interview, once spoke of how martial arts helps us connect to ourself. Not much different than plant medicine. In that, how do we respond to a moment fully, authentically, in the moment? Because life will just kick us up on the board sometimes, and you'll just find yourself riding the wave. As I've heard it said, life can be like a wave. You can't change the wave, though you can learn to ride it. And so for various communities, the waves of life look a lot different than for others, especially when those waves of life have the added context of social and cultural trauma that is coupled with personal trauma. How can someone hold space for another if they have not that context or that awareness of the wave that they're riding through life? And if we're seeing aspects of not valuing those perspectives, those experiences, yet you want to then and I say a you in a general sense, a universal sense, engage with these communities in the name of what? Healing? I was doing a workshop recently, learning skills around how to meet the self where one is in the moment, and to be able to gauge where your stress level is and to be able to down regulate your stress. The facilitator for the workshop spoke to an experience they had when they were engaging in a therapeutic group inside of a prison, engaging with youth. And that the other facilitators, when having a meeting in a healing circle practice of group sharing, one of the young individuals who had not engaged much had a moment of their own emotional emergence and had a big eruption of sharing vulnerably, visibly so. And this individual remarked how the other facilitators were very excited, feeling that there had been a breakthrough and that a healing process was realized. That young individual never returned to that group after that. There was no one there who could hold space for what they had to share. And so, for others, what seemed like a great moment of healing and progression actually ended up being a traumatic moment of regression. We don't know what we don't know. How do we move beyond that? Our knowledge of ourselves and the world informed either directly or indirectly by how we grew up and were engaging with the world. Though at some point we become aware of our ignorance beyond those experiences. From there, where do we go? What choice do we make when engaging with our own ignorance? And that is a personal choice. Someone once said to a group of folks engaging in a diversity, equity, and inclusion workshop, take a moment and reflect upon the handful or so people that you engage with most regularly in your life. What do they look like? Who are they? Where is there the diversity? Where is there the equity? Where is there the inclusion? And where is there not? Again, I offer these not as cliff notes and answers of how to unwrap these enigmas and riddles and challenges of life, though food for thought to help us see ourselves in this moment and to understand How can I recognize where I am right now in this moment? Where do I want to go? And how do I authentically, honestly navigate my way from where I am and where I'm going? Thank you all for listening, taking the time to give consideration to these thoughts and these questions that I've presented. I hope in some way, some piece, some element of it can be of benefit and support and aid to you, not just in your studies and wherever you go in your professional endeavors, though simply in life and manifesting the person that you know you are and can be. Thank you.
That was beautiful. I mean, personally, that like really just like hits home for me and really like puts some things in perspective that I've been struggling with a lot, and something that you said at the beginning, to hold space. It's such a simple phrase for such a complex concept, and there's a lot of things that I've been trying to work on with myself that I feel sound very simple, and the way that people talk about it's very simple. Like, I'll look at the world with new eyes, things like that. But how do you actually do that? You know, because a lot of times these simple things are a lot more harder, or a lot harder to actually put into practice. I've been struggling with that a lot lately, and so this whole talk has just really been very helpful for me, and it's been much different than a lot of the more academic talks that we've had, and it's very refreshing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's seemingly there's more easier to define, I guess, process when it's a tangible something we're looking to engage with and shift our relationship to. When it's non-tangible and it's personal, what does that look like for us?
It's just I'm very glad to hear this, because this is something, like I said, like, it's not really talked about much either. So
Yeah,
where the rubber meets the road, it's kind of left for us to figure out. And so this has been very helpful, and I'm sure it's been helpful for a lot of people as well.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I guess we can transition into the Q&A. And hopefully this has inspired some questions as well. It seemed that, you know, this a lot of times a lot of facts are spit out, and so questions can arise during the talk. But I think your talk was very engaging in a different kind of way, which people could be really following along and listening, as opposed to coming up with their own questions during the talk, which is something that you know, that kind of full listening is rare today. So I think so we have a few people who have prepared questions.
Okay.
Amanda Harshil, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, please correct me if I'm not. And Matt, if any one of you would like to go first with your question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Kufikiri. Really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much for giving it. A question that I had was, when discussing psychedelics, a lot of the viewpoints I've heard have come from a more Western standpoint, I guess. When it, but I know something you mentioned, it's really important to have like very diverse viewpoints, especially for this field and how it can affect like BIPOC communities. And so with that, would you have any recommendations for us students of like psychedelics, of more diverse viewpoints, researchers, authors that we could look towards to find these different viewpoints?
There are becoming more and more platforms online looking to highlight various voices. What comes to mind, the one that's more prominent, or I would say most prominent, is one called Chacruna, Chacruna, if you're not familiar. They do a great job of, chacruna.net. They do a great job of really being the kind of stand apart voice and highlighting different voices, more diverse voices, from the more community and indigenous practice side, from the clinical side, from the behavioral side. And in that way, finding individuals through them would be one way to go. Your question highlights very much where there is that present bias, because often the platform given is not equal in the various voices. And so, as I tongue-in-cheek joked with a friend one time, you can get a sense of who the speakers are going to be at a conference depending on how long the title is. And so oftentimes, especially with highlighting voices, there's a very Western bias. And then even with that, there's a very American Western bias. So that even voices, say, in Europe don't necessarily get the same attention as those voices here in America. There are more and more efforts looking to highlight these voices, to give them the same platform, to give them just as big of a microphone. So there's definitely a lot more work that needs to be done in that way. So to that, as far as publications, as far as any online presence, I would say don't be surprised if you run across a lot of the same individuals. And where you might see one, you'll probably see them in other places, or not too many beyond that. I don't really feel like that's a sufficient answer for your question. I apologize on that. It's just reflective of where we are.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah. There's also an organization in out of Baltimore. They recently changed their name to the Ancestor Project. And they do some really good work as well of looking to highlight voices and engage with more ethnically diverse individuals doing work. The individuals they engage with often are not so much in the clinical side, somewhat on the behavioral, and then more so on the community and an indigenous practice side.
Hi, Kufikiri. Thank you again for joining us today. It was really wonderful and eye-opening. I wanted to go back to something you mentioned in passing earlier in your talk, which was that you mentioned that you prefer the term entheogen to psychedelic. And obviously there's a whole conversation to be had there.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask how you feel that the way we define and refer to psychedelics can maybe connect us to the ancestral practices and kind of be more inclusive, if you have any opinions on that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your question. I recently remarked with an interview that my personal choice of using the word entheogen in a more broader sense as opposed to psychedelic is looking to make an effort to move away from the biases and within the psychedelic community, feeling that the word psychedelic, because of its association with the legacy of the war on drugs, is a loaded term and oftentimes is used as a broad general stroke to describe so many various and different elements and cultures and ways and practices. So entheogen could be considered more postmodern, though I recognize that both words were Western words invented to speak to indigenous practices. And so word choice in this way is challenged because it often is coming from an outside culture to describe another culture. So there is always going to be that shortcoming. For myself, I recall being introduced to ayahuasca and then learning that indigenous cultures who work with it call it yahe, and some people who work with it call it grandmother. So it's sometimes going to beg a little bit more tugging at the thread, if you will, to really follow for yourself, where do you want to then kind of pin yourself in your word choice? Because again, there's a buffet of word choice, even in general broad terms. Psychedelic, entheogen, plant medicine, sacrament, materials. Though I think oftentimes kind of like someone's opinion of you is more reflective of how they see you than who you actually are. These words are more reflective of Western cultures identifying with these indigenous practices more so than what these indigenous practices actually are. And so to that, whatever words you feel comfortable with using, as long as the choice that you make about it is one that's informed. When I studied in graphic design, one of my instructors said, you need to have a reason, not for just everything that is in your final project, but you also need to have a reason for everything you edited out of it. So the process of where you choose to decide for yourself the words that you want to use, being informed of why you choose that word and also why you don't choose others, as opposed to what is the kind of quote unquote accepted, woke term. Because again, we are in a way having our own personal relationship with the journey of how we're engaging with this and how we are making ourselves aware of these cultures and of these practices. I often will recognize where, early on when we were coming in to start the discussion in the class, speaking of being able to engage with nature. And for us in our urban societies, in our Western environments, we feel like we have to enter into nature to engage with it. Oftentimes for indigenous cultures and communities, there is not that separation in their minds. Walking out of their habitat, they are still in their home. Leaving the place that shelters them from the rain and the wind and the cold to go and engage with the nature and the earth around them. It's simply going from like shelter to not shelter. It's not like I went from my home out into nature. So we have a very different perception in the Western world of what it means to actually engage with the world that's all around us, that we've separated ourselves from. Someone once shared with me a meme of a deer on a road in the wilderness. Again, I call it the wilderness. I'll reflect on that later. And it said, "This deer is not crossing the road. This road is crossing the forest." So as long as you're feeling comfortable and informed about what you choose for yourself and are open to the journey that it is, understanding that what may work for you today and tomorrow and next year may not work for you in 3, 4, 5 years. As best as I can respond to the complexities of, again, we live in the softest society where words dictate so much of how we relate to ourselves and everything else around us. You know, especially engaging in these ways of expanding our awareness and our consciousness. Words do not always have the ability to fully encompass what we're looking to express. So just also being aware that a word or a phrase just simply won't do.
Of course. Thank you so much. I feel like informed is really the operative word there. And I think that'll help me personally, at least, make more informed choices and use better judgment. So thank you so much for sharing.
No worries. Thank you for your question.
Hi, I was wondering, so in an interview that you did a few months ago, you said there's not always the broadest willingness from the psychedelic community to look at and deal with its own blind spots and false belief systems. So I was wondering where specifically and in what ways do you see this manifesting in the psychedelic community?
I see this specifically with regards to racial, social, economic class structures within Western society, because of the traditions of clinical and behavioral studies. Oftentimes, the conclusions that were presented around that work was done so in a way that wasn't diverse and informed, carrying those conclusions forward and then applying them to other communities that don't identify with the quote unquote pool is, to put it nicely, clumsy. And so when those same arguments are presented in present day to say a research group, why was there not more diversity in the pool that you were engaging with? And you will often get the same stock answer of, we tried and we weren't able to, or it didn't work out this way, or, whatever stock response they want to give for their lack of effort in that way. It lands in a certain way for those communities that are their next door neighbors to say that we're right here. Yet you say you can't find us, you say you can't see us. And I think that goes back to the risk takers that I speak to needed when engaging in these ecosystems that are being mainstreamed, because if you're getting grant money from somewhere to do this research and you want to present a certain argument of getting that grant money, you know that the words you're using and the way that you're structuring that proposal, you want to do so in the best way to get the grant money, not to start a protest. So when you get that grant money, do you still hold true to how you presented it, where it is more specified and niched and non-inclusive? Do you throw a little okey doke and say one thing, and then once you get the money, you do something else, knowing that that is then a relationship that could be strained to then go back to when you need more grant money in the future? How do you find diverse forms of financial capital to do the work that you're engaged in when those holding the purse strings are content to allow the biases of society to carry on? There was a there was as best as I can put it, there was a sense of, say, about 100 years ago in the 1920s, when there was the rise of Marxism, and it was about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. When those coming over from Europe came to the Americas looking to expand and garner more support when they were engaging with the African American community at the time, and very much coming away with a sense that it was presented in a way of, we understand the challenges that you're faced with, though first help us with ours, and then we'll circle back and help you with yours. That type of mindset is, to a degree, still carried on, where there are those that look to engage to better what society and the world, though they have themselves first in line for the benefits of that. The psychedelic society, I think I spoke to in that interview as well, was born out of privilege. It was born out of Westerners having the economic freedoms and the ability to take time from work to go and travel to an indigenous culture for an extended period of time and to engage in these experiences. That is still very much the case for what can be considered these fly-in retreats. How many people are offering scholarships for those that do not look like them to have the same experience? How many clinical researchers are willing to be the risk taker to engage with those socially and economically marginalized communities to be the focus of, if not at least a relevant and equitable percentage of the pool that they're engaging with? Are those people that they're invited in simply to check a box? Or are they invited in because there is value seen in their voice and what they can contribute when engaging around creating practices within, say, the behavioral science areas of what it looks like for a therapist to hold space for someone that doesn't look like them, and to not trigger them? And thus someone coming into a space looking for healing and then actually leaving feeling harmed. So, case in point, last summer, there were a lot of organizations within the quote unquote psychedelic community who were very quiet around the social ills that were spilling out into the streets. Because they have the choice to not have to say anything.
I think right now you said something. I mean, a lot of what you've been saying is very crucial. But right now, what you said about like people not having the choice, or having the choice not to speak up or engage with certain say like bills or legislation. And I'm just wondering, because sometimes when I see legislation, especially around social issues, it's presented in the way that seems to me to be sometimes a bit more performative than practical, and sometimes you even see opposition from the groups that they're trying to help. And so how do we, especially those who may not be within those groups, how do we make an informed decision to actually do the right thing, as opposed to just kind of following the bandwagon, say off a cliff, perhaps?
That question, and thank you for that question, and also Amanda, thank you for your question as well. That question, I think, harkens to where again we're looking at a journey and not a destination. And so that process begins with listening, the lost art form of listening, active, authentic listening. Because engaging in efforts for the benefit of individuals or communities that don't look like yourself, yet coming to conclusions about what those actions should look like without actually having talked to those individuals and community about what they actually need, and then allowing their voices to inform the process, will, in my opinion, often lead to such disconnect. In that, for myself, someone asked me how I feel about all drug decrim. I said, I'm okay with it. It's all right. They're like, okay, so you just seemed kind of meh on it. I'm like, I am kind of meh on it because it's not what it's doing, it's what it's not doing. For myself and individuals I've spoken to about it, a lot of the language is around the war on drugs, the legacy of the war on drugs, and the impact that it has on certain communities. If we were to snap our fingers and all of a sudden have laws on the books that said police cannot arrest for sale or possession, when we know that the war on drugs is a war on community and people, an extension of oppressive systems and institutions, a vehicle to militarize the police and to do so, will there not be just another vehicle found to continue those practices? If folks can stand on the corner and sell, and folks can walk up and buy, does that mean that the high school graduation rate will increase? Does that mean that suicide deaths will decrease? Does that mean that economic stability and food deserts will shift and change? Does that mean that we will not see a disproportionate section of society in prisons? So for me, it is a good effort, though it is only one step on a journey. And there needs to be so much more coupled with that if we are talking about the legacy of the war on drugs and its impact on communities. So that I use as an example in sharing, again, my singular perspective around who has actually gone into these communities and said, what do you need? Do you actually need the police to stop coming in and harassing those that are selling drugs to make your community better? Or is there something else you need? And I'm here to listen as to how I can support your efforts. Because similar to the healing process of engaging within entheogens, it's not about healing another person. It's about them healing themselves. So how do these communities empower themselves? How can we assist and support in their ability to empower that process of the systems of oppression that they deal with on a daily basis? What is it to say to someone, I want you to relax, and I don't want you to be in fight or flight mode, when they live in an environment where hyper-awareness is survival? You're saying relax, and they're hearing, make yourself vulnerable. In an environment where the cost of that can be very high, even deadly. So again, when it's about a legislative political process, it falls along a very tangible schedule of when is the city council or the state senate hearing this measure, and when are they taking suggestions for amendments, and who is proposing it, and who's leading the task force, and who's financing the ballot measure, and things of that nature. Yet community engagement, community education, community empowerment is again this non-tangible amorphous process which doesn't follow the calendar of politicians. And so if engagement is to really support these other individuals and communities' ability to have agency in their own life, to determine the course of their own life in an informed way, then say you come in and you set up a table saying healing offered, and you're just all excited. You're just there and you got your table and you got your sign and you're ready to go, and you open up the shop, grand opening, and people just keep walking by and no one comes in. And this continues for days, for weeks, for months. And you're like, well, this didn't work. I'm gonna shut down and go. What didn't work? Why didn't you stay? Why didn't you go out of the shop and into the community? One civil rights leader was asked about, this is back in the 60s and 70s, about what is the focus of your group? What are you doing? Like, we are here to support the community. If that means the community needs lunches, we're going to give them lunches. If the community needs shoes, we're going to give them shoes. If the community needs political activism, then we're going to do that. We're here to give the community what the community needs. But that requires engagement and relationship building. And in a way, again, the art of listening and not coming in with predetermined outcomes of what you're looking for, because then the question is, what was really the original intention of why you engaged in it in the first place? Was it for something for self? Or was it for something for that community? No easy answers.
There's definitely not any easy answers with issues like this, and it's great to have a conversation about like the nuances surrounding these kinds of issues, because a lot of times I feel a lot of people want to simplify things to make them more palatable to a larger audience, and in that they lose the integrity of the complexity of the actual issue. So I appreciate this talk a lot, and I think that's been all for our prepared questions. And so if anyone else has any questions or comments or would like to discuss anything, please feel free to either type into the chat and one of us can read it out loud, one of the facilitators, or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
I have a question. If
Yes.
that's yeah. So earlier you were discussing the like your understanding that race is like constructed socially and for like economic reasons and political reasons, which is something that like it's really interesting because I feel like I see that discussed academically more than I do socially, which is sort of surprising to me because it seems like something that would be such like a liberating social, or is such a liberating social concept. So I was wondering if like in connection between like that point that you made in your work, if you see psychedelics or entheogens, especially like collective experiences, as maybe tools for like deconstructing race and deconstructing like whiteness and hierarchy. And yeah, just curious about that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I I I definitely see the synchronicity of this moment where entheogens and engaging with the practices of plant medicine can be a momentary interrupter to the kind of autopilot that we move through in society. Though, again, in the journey of it, a singular experience had that is not integrated can easily roll back into the fog of the mind. And then we can make whatever meaning of it we choose to, if we're not continually engaging in what we've been shown or message we've received. And so to that, it can offer a glimpse of what is possible. So apart from that experience, if we're not actively making efforts within ourselves and within our own lives to carry that forward, then it's just a singular experience. As well, it's also not uncommon where in the academic spaces to simply entertain such discussions simply for the theoretical discussion in and of itself, and not actually to do so to impact and affect change socially, simply for the more academic exercise of the discussion. So I think that's where sometimes we do not see that, I guess, for lack of a better term, the spill over from those conversations happening in a larger social discussion. And to that, at the same time, from my perspective, the hypocrisies that the construct of race presents, it is not to say that there is zero value in them, because at the same time, we also live in a society that uses victimization as a way of social advancement. And so the value of reliving one's narrative through that perspective is at times incentivized. So to completely abandon that is to also abandon whatever social incentivizing is available. A very obvious example of that would be something like, the quota systems of affirmative action in the 80s and 90s for colleges. So certain folks would be like, my ethnic and racial identities impact me negatively in this way, though it also allows for me to gain access in other ways. And there may not be the full willingness to completely abandon all of it altogether, because then we're, what is on the other side of that? So in that part, yes, academic conversations will focus on this, though not necessarily enter into the social space, because sometimes that's not always the intention. And at the same time, if what's presented to you, to an individual in a way of advancing socially, is to present themselves by way of their trauma, I want this scholarship, but to get this scholarship, I need to talk about the trauma of my life. When this is kind of the environment we're presented with to navigate, it's not always a clear and direct answer of what does it look like to then say, you know what, I'm done with this race game and I'm just ready to walk away and not even play the game. I wish on that, registration form that I didn't have to say race and I could just put ethnicity. It's like, but I want to go get tested. So it's an interesting dynamic because it's something that's been around for a long time. It's very ingrained in a lot of the institutions, and there's the familiarity, and we are creatures of habit. So even if something is negatively impacting us, the familiarity of it is sometimes easier to deal with than the unknown and the unfamiliar of what may exist, to let that go and to move beyond that. And again, that can land in a very much in a personal choice, in a personal way. I hope my response in some way would answer your question. I feel like I.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really interesting response. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's funny answering the question about race, because I feel like race is more something that it more has to do with how others view you than how you view yourself. So I always feel kind of funny answering that question, whereas I feel, yeah, much more comfortable answering the question about my ethnicity, which is more specific to like culture that you know my ancestors have come from or whatnot.
Yeah, you know, and we can see it historically with various groups that, as most of us did, came to this country, and once arriving, coming into the society that navigated itself through race, where all of a sudden the trade-off of ethnic identity for social status based on race, that it requires all of us to deny a part of ourselves to perpetuate the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like with especially like these conversations in academic circles, it's kind of interesting because a lot of times, myself coming from like personally like a low income background and coming to an elite college, it's been a very strange experience for me, and I'm surrounded by much different people than I'm used to. And it's been really like enlightening in a lot of ways, but it's also kind of interesting to hear conversations about like class, especially, which I relate to more than conversations about race because I don't have as much of an inside experience with that. But with the class thing, it's interesting because a lot of times, you know, these conversations about class are being held at an elite institution by people of much higher uh, class than I came from originally. So it's kind of interesting to hear their perspective and to hear their well intentions. But sometimes I feel like some things aren't really understood from the inside. And when I try to give my voice, I would have to, I kind of have to qualify myself as a low income person, which is something that most of my life I've been very ashamed to do. And so it's interesting that, you know, I have to like let people know that, you know, I've been through this in order for them to hear my perspective, because sometimes what I say doesn't align with the narrative that's being perpetuated by people of higher class when they're talking about these class issues. And so that qualifying kind of statement, before I make that, people don't really listen to me because they just assume that I'm, you know, have a similar background as them. And so sometimes it can be kind of difficult. And I can imagine there's a very similar thing going on with the race discussion as well, especially in academic circles.
Definitely. Yeah. It's a unique dance we play. We play it out every day. I also like to invite, even if it's not a question, if someone just has a reflection or a thought, you know, if it doesn't have a question mark on the end of it, it doesn't disqualify it from something to be shared here.
I'd just quickly like to ask in an interview with Shakruna, actually, you mentioned that you felt that the psychedelic community was kind of siloed into, a variety of groups, sort of to the detriment of all. So I wanted to ask a little bit about what that looks like and how we might be able to sort of foster dialogue.
Yeah, thank you for your thank you for that. Thank you for your question. There's definitely a siloing within the kind of umbrella psychedelic community, in that, especially for the ecosystems that I spoke to, they're being mainstreamed um, in the clinical and behavioral research science side. They too amongst themselves are siloed. And then those kind of ecosystems are definitely siloed away from the more areas that look to engage in community and in indigenous practices. And myself, having been a part of efforts to look to kind of cultural bridge between them, saw very much the kind of dug in mindset around what it means to do so. And circling back on something that was spoken to earlier, before a conversation could even begin, and this was a conversation structured in a way of clinical engaging with community, before just, like the first call was like a couple of hours, and before we could even get into conversation, all we did was just have introductions, because everyone, you know, to a certain degree, felt the need to um, kind of read off their cliff notes, you know, of accomplishments. And so then the second time we met, it was a discussion around what words are we going to use. Those coming from the community side, well, these are the words I use. The clinical side, where I don't feel comfortable using those words, and these are the words I use. Community side was, I don't feel comfortable using those words. So just in trying to find a common ground on the word choice of what we're actually even talking about before we were even actually could talk about it, proved itself to be very challenging. So much so that it created a lot of resistance in even any efforts being made. And to that, even within the more community aspect of practices and those that facilitate and those that engage with indigenous cultures, there is a siloing around the different types of entheogens that folks will engage with. I myself will often say how the amorphous term of the psychedelic community, individuals tend to identify with it in the way that they had an experience that introduced them to it and it to them. So that, I know a lot of people who engage with cannabis and don't consider themselves a part of the psychedelic community. And I know people in the psychedelic community that see cannabis as a sacrament. Just differing perspectives there. At the same time, there are those who specifically engage with wanting to work with, say, psilocybin and with mushrooms. And that's for them. That's what's working for them. And that's their path and their focus. They are not having a lot of conversations with folks who are in ayahuasca communities and yahe communities. Someone speaking to me that is in a conversation talking about where they are very engaged within Ibogaine and the Iboga community, and talking about challenges of kind of the cancel out culture that they were experiencing in that community, in that space, and saying, yeah, because the ayahuasca community, they're doing a lot better. That space is doing a lot better about addressing this. And I'm like, aren't we both in a psychedelic community? How is that being addressed differently in one space than it is in the other? Yet that exists. And so whether it's a self-selection, whether it's a perpetuating of isolation and siloing that people came into, and they just kind of keep perpetuating that, there is not a lot of proactive effort to cultural bridge between those and across those. Yet there are individuals who will say, I've had an experience with this, and I've had an experience with that, and I've had an experience with this. Though, you know, I may tend to kind of like high school style, I may tend to just hang out with one group of folks during lunchtime, even though I have friends, you know, all around the school that do a bunch of different things. And so, yeah, why is that? I don't really know. I think there's a benefit in kind of knocking down the siloing and doing more cultural bridge building, you know, to that as well in the mainstreaming of things and the commercialization of things. Seeing a lot of this as a product, and because it's being commodified, will totally take away the opportunity to understand where this comes from, why this is even accessible now in this moment, what it looks like and where it's going. You know, an instructor of mine talking about kind of just the life cycle of products. And this is something that's being looked to be made to a product to a certain degree. The analogy they used is a toothbrush. Most people go to the store, walk down the aisle, look for the toothbrush they want, purchase it, use it. When they're done, they throw it away. And that's the only time they had a concept of it. They weren't thinking about the resources that came out of the ground to make it, the company and the factory that had to assemble it and make it and put it in the store. And they're not thinking about where it goes once it's in their trash can and it goes into a landfill. So oftentimes our awareness of things is only in the scope of how much we're actually engaging with it within our own lives. So similarly to the kind of larger psychedelic community, if someone is of a mindset of I'm only engaging with maybe one specific or one or two specific entheogens or plant medicines, they don't have that awareness of what's going on in other spaces with folks who are engaging with other kinds. And there, again, there's not that proactiveness around turning and looking and opening up their awareness to that. Why that is, I mean, there can be a lot of answers around that can land in personal reasons, that can land in kind of social kind of narratives that we're just regurgitating, for lack of a better term, to a certain degree. Though, yeah, it's present and it's there. And I do feel it is to the detriment of being able to have strength in numbers around having a more holistic approach.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's kind of interesting, I mean, to hear how your work with people on the clinical side and the research side, as well as for people from other parts of the psychedelic community, kind of have a differing language, kind of like a barrier in terms of vocabulary. And I'm sort of wondering, or in the future, I think I'll probably be a little quicker to notice those differences among people like myself who aren't quite at that level yet, but are sort of in some way still a part of the community. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And, you know, best of luck to you on your journey with that, because it is again, part of that dance, because there is still, even with engaging with this and a lot of the language coming out to laud the benefits of engaging with this, there are still a great many on the more clinical research side that have apprehension around showing themselves to be engaging with this beyond just the lab room, because of the stigmas that exist in that way of not wanting to invalidate their voice, of wanting to, you know, again, about career and about projection professionally. So just wishing you all the best on that.
Thank you so much, Kufikiri.
No worries. Thank you. Let's see, was there a question in there? Do you think that learning opinions and perspectives within the psychedelic movement?
And so we have just a few minutes left if anybody has any lingering questions or thoughts.
I think there was one in the chat. Let's see. Do you?
Yeah.
I'll just read it out. Do you think that the variety of opinions and perspectives within the psychedelic movement cause a divisiveness that threatens and inhibits the progress of the movement, or do you think that is actually beneficial? Mm. Hmm. And or both and um, there's benefits in having focus that is very clearly defined in efforts and engaging in whatever goalpost you have for wherever you stick that in the ground of what success looks like. And so those that have a vision that also has the same goalpost, they can help you drive towards that. And so there's that benefit there in having voices and perspectives that share those efforts and those ideas. At the same time, a diversity and variety of information resources helps us to approach challenges from a perspective we may not have considered. Example, I had a photographer teacher say one time whose sole focus, because in the world of photography, there's various types of photography. And so they tell you if you're going to get into photography, find a focus and drive towards that because you want your portfolio to be able to represent that. So it could be travel, it could be fashion, it could be street, it could be architecture, it could be nature. And this instructor was fashion focused. And scouting a site, their other photographer friend who's architecture focused came along to just do some test shots of the site. So my instructor, being a fashion photographer, is looking for areas that would look good for a fashion photo shoot. Their friend, as an architectural photographer, is just looking for perspectives and angles that show the architecture of the space. So they're not even shooting the same things. My photographer teacher looked at the shots that their architecture photographer friend had shot and were like, I actually like your shots a lot better than mine. And so when it actually came time to approach doing, say, like a product shoot, my instructor talked about how they decided to experiment with that. And even though they were shooting a teapot for a tea company, they were like, you know what? I'm not going to shoot this teapot like a product shot. I'm going to shoot it like a fashion shoot. So they talked about almost in a way of humanizing the object and how to create a narrative of the character of a simple teapot as if they were doing a fashion shoot with it instead of a product shoot. All that to say, it doesn't change your goalpost to take in the consideration of others and what may be best practice to arrive at what you're defining as success. It can just simply be data and information to give consideration to. To the degree that you allow that to impact and change your perspective of the work you're doing is a personal choice of the individual and the collective and the group. Thank you for your question.
Awesome. So it looks like it's about that time where we'll be ending class, and I just want to say that, like, just want to extend all of our gratitude and tell you thank you, because this has been much different than a lot of the talks that we've had, and they've been a lot more applicable to like the lives of individuals, I think, and just I think they've been very useful in terms of facilitating a discussion around sensitive issues that aren't always I think addressed with the mindfulness that they were addressed with today. And so I just really want to extend my appreciation.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you all, to the folks that had to run, and to the folks that are here. Again, I was so happy and honored to again be able to just engage in a discussion with you all, to just share my unique perspective and experiences, and in whatever way, again, that they can be of support and benefit of aid to you in wherever your journey leads you in life and in your work. I hope there's a little piece there that can do that. And again, thank you to you all.
I also want to mention really quick before you leave that we do have a club that this class is born out of, and we would love to continue our relationship with you and to maybe engage with you in the future. I think that'd be really awesome.
Yeah, no, thank you for that invitation. I would love to, for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you for like I said, we've had a lot of very knowledgeable and informative talks, but I think this one has been the wisest.
Oh. The audience makes the speaker. Thank you.